Good morning. I'm really glad to be talking to you this morning about the PCUSA's initiative as our church becomes a Matthew 25 church. As you may know from the previous adult education class, the three prongs of the Matthew 25 are building church vitality, as you heard from Reverend Harry Iberts and Reverend Black last week, dismantling structural racism that you will be hearing about next week from Gail and Dennis. And today we'll be focusing on eradicating systemic poverty. I'm going to start by asking Alice Tinkle to read Matthew 25, 35 through 40 as our call to worship this morning.
Okay. For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick and in prison and visited you? And the king will answer them, truly, I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me.
Thank you, Alice. I think that's a scripture we cannot hear too many times. Since this is an education class, and I've written a little pop quiz. So you need to get out your paper and pencil, or just get on your thinking caps, as we used to say back in the 60s. And I'm going to read 5 multiple choice questions, and I'll answer each one as we go. So it's not going to be something you really have to remember. But once a teacher, always a teacher. And don't worry, it's not one of those dreaded essay tests. The first question: 25% of young children live in poverty in what country? A, India, B, Kenya, C, the United States. Anyone want to take a guess?
C.
C, you are correct. Number 2, the federal minimum wage is A, $15, B, $10, C, $7.25.
C.
C.
It is C. A footnote to that, though, the federal minimum wage for tipped workers, such as waitresses, is $2.13 an hour. Fortunately, in Santa Fe, we have a living wage, but I think tipped wages are still remain the same. I was shocked when my daughter worked as a waitress one summer or several summers during college, and her tips far outweighed what she was paid hourly. She was fortunate. Number 3, what percent of government public assistance went to people working full-time, but who still fell below the poverty level? A, 25%, B, 50%, C, 15%. Anyone want to take a guess?
I'll guess A.
It's B, 50%.
Whoa.
50% of government public assistance went to people working full-time, but who still fell below the poverty level. Number 4, since 1978, CEOs' compensation in the US has grown 940%. What percentage have workers' average wages increased? A, 20%, B, 12%, C, 40%.
B.
You are correct, 12%. Number 5, this is the last one. Wealth is measured by everything you have minus what you owe. In New Mexico, the average wealth for white people is $133,000. What is the average wealth for people of color? A, 75,000, B, 60,000, C, 31,600.
C.
C is correct again, 31,600. So how'd you do on the test? Would you grade yourself? These statistics are, as staggering as they are, don't begin to tell the whole and complex story of poverty. Poverty in children is the greatest threat to the healthy development of a child, and its long-lasting negative consequences are inadequate quality and quantity of food, exposure to violence, underfunded schools, and poor early childhood education, frequent housing mobility, and exposure to pollution and other health risks such as asbestos and tainted water. But poverty doesn't only affect the young and their families. High debt loads, whether from such events as retirement insecurity, medical expenses, or even college tuition loans, are also characteristic of poverty in the United States. Mass incarceration of people of color leads to poverty, especially in single-parent families. Homelessness is of course, one of the most egregious signs of poverty. Those of you who have volunteered at the shelter have a sense of what homelessness in Santa Fe looks like. Untreated physical and mental illness gives rise to people living in poverty. Huge spending by the federal government on the military has shifted money away from the programs aimed to help the poor. Of course, we have also recently seen the disparity in medical treatment of COVID between white and people of color populations. As Reformed Christians, Presbyterians believe that government is God's agent when it comes to taking care of people. We also believe that creation is entrusted to our care. The PCUSA is guided by policies from the General Assembly. The guidelines for developing social witness policy are based on scripture, the Book of Confessions, social and natural science analysis, and the voices of those who are unheard or discriminated against. The General Assembly has spoken many times about poverty. And I'm going to ask Jim to read the statement from 2010 General Assembly. Jim Elliott.
The 222nd General Assembly of 2016 called on the church to do the following: recommit ourselves at the congregational level, the mid-council level, and the national levels of our church to locate ourselves with the poor, to advocate with all of our voice for the poor, and to seek opportunities to take risk for and with the poor in the soup kitchens and Catholic worker houses, among the immigrants and those working to end mass incarceration, and with those who seek to protect all of us, especially the poorest of the poor around the world, from the vagaries of climate change. And that's from the minutes of 2016, Part 1, page 700. The Presbyterian Mission Agency work with respect to poverty will focus on these 5 outcomes. Presbyterians understanding a biblical and theological framework for dismantling poverty. Presbyterians have genuine, equitable, and non-paternalistic relationships with and learn from people who struggle with poverty. Presbyterians understand the intersectional root causes of poverty and racism. Presbyterians participate in advocacy toward dismantling poverty. Presbyterians are generous in supporting efforts to lift communities out of poverty.
Thank you, Jim.
No quiz.
As you can see, we have direct instructions from General Assembly. And at the time that this was written, our country was going through a difficult time of recession, but little did we know how hard 2020 was going to be for many of our fellow citizens, and how this statement speaks to what we are presently going through. What are some of the scriptures that guide us in our response to poverty? I've chosen 4 from many that are in the Bible, both in the Old and New Testament. David Mason is going to read to us from Deuteronomy 15, 7 through 11.
Okay, this is from the New Living Translation. But if there are any poor Israelites in your towns, when you arrive in the land your Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward them. Instead, be generous and lend them whatever they need. Do not be mean-spirited and refuse somebody a loan because the year of canceling debts is close at hand. If you refuse to make a loan and the needy person cries out to the Lord, you will be considered guilty of sin. Give generously to the poor, not grudgingly, for the Lord your God will bless you in everything you do. There will always be some in the land who are poor. That is why I'm commanding you to share freely with the poor and with other Israelites in need.
Thank you, David. Marianne Amos is going to read to us from Proverbs.
This is, excuse me, this is Proverbs 31, verse 8 and 9. Open your mouth for the dumb, for the rights of all who are left desolate. Open your mouth, judge righteously, maintain the rights of the poor and needy.
Thank you, Marianne. And I'm going to ask Jane Stringfellow to read from 1 John.
This is 1 John, verse 17. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him.
And Bruce Black is reading James 2, 15 through 16.
This is from Eugene Peterson's The Message. Dear friends, you think you'll get anywhere in this if you learn all the right words, but never do anything. Does merely talking about faith indicate that a person really has it? For instance, you come upon an old friend dressed in rags and half starved and say, "Good morning, friend. Be clothed in Christ. Be filled with the Holy Spirit," and walk off without providing so much as a coat or a cup of soup. Where does that get you? Isn't it obvious that God talk without God acts is outrageous nonsense?
Thank you, Bruce. I think each one of these scripture lessons leads us to understand that as Christians, we must share with all of God's people. This understanding expands the meaning to a phrase that we've used in our church for a number of years, radical hospitality. But how are we to respond? Even as we look around us in Santa Fe, this mandate to eradicate systemic poverty seems an overwhelming task. But as a wise woman once said, if your task was easy to accomplish, then your vision is too small. We as a church have the opportunity to work with other churches, other social agencies, to be relational in working toward ending poverty. As your mission and social justice chair for a number of years, I will tell you that as a committee, we have, through your generous donations, given funds to many organizations. But is financial aid enough? I think not. Matthew 25 initiative asks us not just to write a check, but to be the hands and feet of Jesus. I'd like to talk about a few ways that I think we can work together in thinking about what we can do or are doing already. The New Mexico Coalition to End Homelessness estimates that in Santa Fe, we are lacking 5,000 affordable houses. The median income or the median home cost in Santa Fe is now $500,000, which partially explains why 10% of Santa Fe public school students are homeless, according to the statistics that Adelante keeps. Adelante, of course, you know, is one agency that we have as a church funded generously over the past several years. We should do what we can to support home ownership. A number of you have worked on Habitat homes or know about the good work that HomeWise does. And if you read the paper this morning or this week, it was mentioned several times. Anchoram St. Vincent's and Enterprise Bank and HomeWise have collaborated together to raise $10 million to address the affordable housing problem that we have in Santa Fe. So that's encouraging news. I recently had the experience of Bill Eklund and I have been working to try to help a young asylum seeker who has received his work permit, has his Social Security, and he was leaving one house that he had been living in for a year, thanks to a generous donation by a woman that I haven't even met face to face. But we thought, well, we'll just find him a cheap rent. He'll have to live with some people. He could go down to the park and maybe meet some men that he could share a house with. And so Bill was kind of working on that aspect along with Maritab. I went to several of the motels, 3 or 4 of them on Cerrillos Road, that used to be day motels and now are monthly motels. And I have to admit, I was in shock. The monthly rent for a single room with a hot plate ranged from $700 to $875 a month. And these are not nice places. These are really old hotels, probably built in the 50s. David Mason could tell me when some of these were built. I was pretty much blown away. I had thought in my own head that maybe 500 would be the top of the line for this kind of rental. But as you can see, the housing here is desperate. The other area that I think we need to consider working in is to protect those that are evicted. The federal moratorium on eviction, as far as I know, still runs out December 31st. And without it, 40% of New Mexicans are endangered of being evicted. But there is some hope. The New Mexico Mortgage Finance Authority has $12.3 million available to pay back as much as $4,500 to individual families for rent or mortgages. Now that money's not going to last forever, but it's a start. And recently, the New Mexico Supreme Court issued a ban on eviction until the end of COVID, but it still hasn't stopped some landlords from evicting their renters. Another area that we could be working on is lobbying for public transportation and food stores on the south side of our town. Chain Breakers, which again, First Press has donated to, has for several years advocated in the state legislature to expand bus service in the south side, and also has been working on low-income housing policies. Andrew Black has talked to us a number of times about Southside being a food desert with no real grocery stores within walking distance of some neighborhoods, forcing parents to buy non-nutritious food at very high prices at Allsup's and other corner stores. How can we support, and this is something I don't feel that we have done as a church or as a mission committee, how can we support job training programs? This seems like a project that's going to be essential in 2021 as businesses close, more people become unemployed and need to be retrained for other jobs. Another area of concern is to help close the digital divide for children who may be going online to school for an extended period of time in 2021. Andrew tells the story of driving down to the Southside Library during a very cold day in the winter and seeing 3 teenagers huddled along the wall by the Southside Library in order to make use of their internet. So having hotspots around town where kids who don't have the internet at their home available would be an area that we could, I think that we could address. Also, lobbying to change laws and policies that perpetuate exploitation of the poor. Let me give you an example. In the legislature in 2017, there was a proposal to limit the interest on payday loans and the amount that could be borrowed. And this payday loans, as you know, throw people into a never-ending cycle of debt. People who are poor often use these companies for emergencies such as medical care or funeral expenses, but they fail to realize that the outrageous interest that is charged is usury. There have been reports in some states that have payday loans of up to 465% interest on some of the loans. Now in New Mexico, in 2000, I think it was 2017, Bruce might know more about this than I do. Payday loans were they were limited and they were illegal. They were made illegal. However, there's something called a small cash loan, and people can still borrow up to $5,000, but they have a 120-day repayment, and there are 4 payment schedules during that time period. So it's not all the money isn't required at one time. But still, the interest on these can be as high as 175% in Santa Fe. And I just flipping through the telephone book the other day, I noticed that there were probably 3 or 4 listed that are still this type of loan, whether it's a title loan or they call them small cash loans, I guess. So that's an area that I think we need to think about and maybe find some way to address. Another example of legislation that was passed recently with the help of New Mexico Voices for Children benefited 300,000 children, with 70% of these children coming from people of color families. I heard about this on a Presbyterian Zoom meeting recently when the director of New Mexico Voices of Children talked about it. And he happened to be Kathleen Jimenez's brother, which many of you will remember Kathleen as the director at, co-director with her husband at Ghost Ranch Santa Fe. He also talked about the working family tax. No, that was the working family tax credit. He also talked about the Medicaid expansion for New Mexico under the Affordable Care Act. And that caused the rate of uninsured children to drop significantly. I want to close by reading Isaiah 10, 1 and 3, because it gives us some direction. Woe to those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights. Something we can think about. What do you feel called to do toward eradicating systemic poverty? I know some of you are already working in programs, involved in programs that help to do this. And I'd like you to tell us what you feel should be done, what is being done that we might all know about. So I'm going to open it up and ask Cece to unmute if people have been muted, and to have a little discussion for about 15 minutes.
Okay, they'll have to unmute themselves.
Okay, please unmute yourself, Sen. I know Jane Hanna, I see her in California, has worked on this issue with the National Church for a long, long time. And so Jane, if you have any comments that would start us out, that would be great.
Well, one of the things that I've put a lot of energy into the last few years is trying to get the minimum wage raised. It seems to me that, first of all, the $15 that they're talking about isn't enough. It's not a livable wage anymore. And if we're going to have a minimum wage, it seems to me we ought to have a maximum, maybe not a maximum wage, but the maximum amount of money that any single person can collect. Because I've read numerous times recently that about 10% of the world's people own 90% of the world's wealth. And that's the beginning of our problem right there, it seems to me. So agitating for changed attitudes, I think, and behavior concerning income is probably a worldwide massive need. And I think the COVID has brought that situation more and more to the forefront of our recognition that the way we think about money needs to be changed.
Thank you, Jane. Other comments? Cece?
Well, I believe if we're going to have a minimum wage, it has to also be pegged to inflation or the cost of living. If it remains static, then over time that gap will return.
Right.
If you have a comment, would you raise your hand or just speak out? I'm not seeing everybody at one time, so I can't call on you, but please just speak.
Judy,
Yes.
this is Mary Ann. I just wanted to say that I think the digital divide, or whatever the correct terminology is for it, is really important on a lot of levels. People who live in rural areas right now, oftentimes their children are moving in with relatives someplace else because they don't have internet access, so they can't go to virtual schools. And I think right here, as you mentioned, in Santa Fe, there are kids that don't have access to the internet. There are not enough hot spots. It seems to me that in our current society, having access to the internet is just as important as having electricity in your home. And back in the 30s, when the undertaking for rural electrification went into effect, it really changed the lives for many people who lived on farms, who lived in rural areas. And I think we need to push for something like that, that on a federal level, to provide for internet capabilities for every household in this country. Now, I know that there are some that don't even have indoor plumbing, but I also think that we need to really look at the internet in a different way.
I remember when the internet first became a very popular thing, and some buses that were transporting Navajo children from school to their homes started to have internet, and the children were given laptops and could make use of that hour-long bus ride, or even longer, I think, in some cases. So I think being creative about where to put hotspots, and your idea of the federal electrification as a total program sounds really solid. Thank you for your comment, Marianne.
Judy, I just have an idea that has been percolating for years in our church and in Santa Fe about having another location that we can be in places that are closer to the lower income people in our community. And thinking about COVID, and once we were able to get out in the world a little better, and how a lot of businesses are not having a building any longer because it's just not viable. If we were to figure out a way that we can be a space for social service agencies or some other places that just need a place without having to put money into overhead, that it could be a place of sharing, a place of gathering, a place of creative thinking when we gather groups together, and just how our church might facilitate something finally that gets us out of our triangle here on the north side or close to town, and in other places where people are, where gatherings can happen, where people can have conversations and move into a new world that we're all facing. Just another idea to add to what we've already talked about for years.
Thank you. I have a friend who says that Santa Fe is really two cities. They're everyone north of St. Francis and everyone south of St. Francis.
Oh, wait a minute.
I mean, there's nothing that says that you couldn't take these businesses who have shut down for various reasons and maybe, lease them for a little bit for nothing more than setting up hotspots. There's really you don't have to worry about turning on the heat or anything like that. All you have to have is electricity. And I'm sure that, you can get a decent laptop for internet surfing anyway, for $400 or $500. Granted, it's not that powerful, but it would serve a lot of people. If the place is big enough, you could set up social distances like we have had, somewhat in education environments, and have people gather there. And I'm sure there's some places very near South Side that are no longer in business.
I think we've got a new job for you, Cece.
That's okay. It's not the first time I've done that.
I know. Our church has worked a long time with the Lutheran Advocacy Ministry with Ruth Hoffman, and there is a new person, Ruth retired, Kurt Rager, and he has been meeting with Reverend Scott Powers, Roger Scott Powers, who is a pastor in Presbyterian pastor in Albuquerque, and other church members, other representatives of different churches. And each year, because we have not, as a Presbyterian congregation, had an advocate in the legislature to represent values that we feel are important for New Mexico, Lutheran Ministry advocacy has been our advocate. And they are meeting, and they may have already met. During this, probably this week or last week, to develop different strategies and policies that they want to present to the legislature. And generally they are policies that are evolved around poverty, and I don't know if they will be around racism, but there certainly will be an opportunity for us to talk more about what they are doing in the legislature.
Judy, how is the minimum wage determined relative to the size of the family?
You know, I don't know the answer to that, David. Does anyone have that information?
Are you talking about for purposes of calculating the poverty level?
No, let's say you have a standard family of 4, and there's only one wage earner. So does that vary on what the minimum wage is going to be, as opposed to, say, a single person living by themselves who is a wage earner? I don't know how that's computed.
Yeah, short answer, no. You get the same minimum wage everybody gets for the poverty level in federal programs. If you are trying to support a family of 4 on that wage, you get other benefits that maybe a single person wouldn't be eligible for.
So a family of 4, for example, you would take that $15 an hour and multiply it by 4?
For poverty purposes, there's a set level for set number of individuals, what the poverty level is. And if you're below that line, then you can get food stamps and all, several other federal benefits. But if you're working at McDonald's, you get $15 an hour, whether you're supporting one person or 14.
I think that was probably the statistic I read to you at the very beginning that was the most startling for me, that the percentage of government public assistance that went to people working full time but still fell below the poverty line was 50%.
Wow. Yeah.
Kind of on a little bit different subject, what you were reading from the PCUSA at the beginning, I think, said that Presbyterians should be educated about many things. And I'm a person who, we make significant donations every year to different organizations. And I think it would be really helpful if we understood the values that we want to uphold better, and that we had something like regular, I don't know, Zooms for Mission or something like that, or written in the e-news, that we had regular reports. Judy, you've done some really good ones, like you wrote about the NAACP, and I think it would help people feel connected to these activities that we are doing at a church, not just as a church, not just our congregation, but also if we knew what was happening in Presbytery along these lines and what the General Assembly says. I think it's just we're kind of disconnected from that part of our church activities.
That's a really good suggestion, Esther, and it's something that we've talked about in Mission and Social Justice a great deal, is how do we communicate with the congregation, first of all, about where your money is being spent, the money that you give to our church so generously. So, and and we've done it in a couple ways. I mean, we had a mission fair last year when we were still inside the church, but I agree with you. I think that the more education we can do, particularly about local agencies, for example, Chain Breakers was an agency when Karen was the head of mission and social justice. She was also on the national board of self-development of people. And self-development of people is kind of a grassroots funding organization or agency of the Presbyterian Church. And the application has to come from they can't be nominated. It has to come from the group that wants the money. And Chain Breakers, Karen and I went and talked a long time and toured Chain Breakers, and they wrote a great application for funds. And at that time, I think they were even just repairing bicycles and teaching bicycle maintenance to homeless people and to kids and anybody who came along and wanted a bicycle. But just knowing that they got that self-development of people grant, I think we advertised it at the time in the church bulletin, but I think it's that kind of thing that a lot of us don't know about, because first of all, there's so many agencies in need. And secondly, that's just not in our wheelhouse.
Right. Well, I think we could, I think we could come up with some ways of using the communications that we have to kind of make a continuing presence, always a presence of this part of our most important part, maybe, of our activities.
The stewardship committee asked Mission and Social Justice to provide the 3 videos that we've done the last 3 Sundays on just to show 3 agencies, but I'm certain that we could do other agencies too, and find a place to post them, either a link on the e-news as you suggested, or incorporating them somehow in the service. And I appreciate that suggestion, and several of you that are on the Mission and Social Justice Committee that are on this morning, please make sure we do that. Thanks for the suggestion.
Okay, Jim.
Along Esther's lines, the men's breakfast program for December 12th, the second Saturday in December, is going to be the potential and power of educating prison populations. And that falls right under this bailiwick. David Rowan is going to be doing that program. The Presented by Men's Breakfast series, in principle, could be expanded to do more social justice presentations. So that's an idea I wanted to talk about. Another idea, picking up on what CC and others have talked about on hotspots, is one thing we might want to look into is how can we make our own homes as personal hotspots? How can we expand the radius of around our homes so that other people could use our internet service? That's something I think we might want to think about. So not only businesses, and you could also maybe possibly have a program with already existing commercial businesses. Like I'm thinking of, think of maybe Domino Pizza as having a hotspot for people, and then it could also benefit them perhaps commercially as well. But I think there are a lot of ideas in which we could expand the internet service too.
Thank you.
Well, there was, I don't know, it was either last year or the year before, there was an initiative that the city of Santa Fe was trying to set up to have business make their businesses hotspot and share their capability. But over the last year or so, that seems to have died. So I don't know what caused it. I know it just came to a halt. because one of the buildings they were talking about was the First Presbyterian church's ceiling. So I think if we do nothing more than just to say, what happened to it? Let's make it active. Let's quit talking about it and do something.
I'm going to close now because I know Cece needs some time to transition, but I thank you for attending this morning. I'm going to close with Psalm 9:18. For the needy shall not always be forgotten, nor the hope of the poor perish forever. Let it be so. Have a good week.
Okay.